Okay. Well, good morning, everyone. First and foremost, hi Mel. First and foremost, thanks for joining us on this celebration of the ADA Act. I want to welcome all those in attendance. My name is Freddie Garcia. I serve as a DEI officer at the Hudson Gateway Association of Realtors, and I'm really excited to host this panel and celebrate the ADA anniversary with some of our community partners, experts, and contributors in this space. Before we get started, I do want to first and foremost recognize the folks behind the scenes who've put a lot of work to make this happen. So first, want to recognize our Fair Housing Committee of Laura Sejdi and Rich Herska, our leaders there, for their contributions, commitment, and work in putting this together. Also want to thank our DEI committee and its leadership, Tony Ruperto, Cheryl Williams, for leading this effort in collaboration and partnership. At HGAR, we value the participation of our members. They do this on a volunteer basis, and so really are grateful for making us a great organization and leading us into the work of the future. Thanks to all the staff for making this happen. Gary, who some of you received emails or have met briefly. Gary for putting this on. Amy and the entire HGAR staff for all the support. It takes a lot of work to put these things together, and so want to recognize them. And then lastly, to our speakers, which you'll hear a little bit from in a bit. Folks are really busy. It's the middle of the summer. And so I really want to thank each of you for saying yes, and then also obviously joining us today. So before we get started, I'd love for the panelists to introduce themselves, and we'll go around. So I'll start with Inaudi, and then we'll take it from there. So Inaudi, if you can tell us a little bit about yourself before we get going.
Thank you so much, Freddie, for inviting me to be a part of this really wonderful group and conversation. I'm really looking forward to it. Good morning, everyone. My name is Inaudi Gill. I use the pronouns she and her. I'm the executive director for the Orange County Human Rights Commission. I've been in my role for a little bit over 6 years, and I work really closely with the community, with community organizations, on all things human rights, on all things social justice, on all things diversity, accessibility, equity, inclusion. We are all about education and awareness and bringing forward really the voices that sometimes cannot use their voices. So we are here to represent them, and I'm really excited to be part of this conversation. Thank you, Freddie.
Thanks, Inaudi. Emma?
Hi, good morning. Emma Hambright. I am the Vice President for Social and Human Services for RUPCO. I've been in my role for about 2 years, and I like to say that I sort of oversee the people and not the buildings. And so that sort of means a little bit of, I always sort of say, a jack of all trades, master of none. And so I am an attorney by trade. I'm licensed to practice in California and Washington, D.C. My specialty in both of those states, really, we're working with people with all disabilities, but in particular intellectual and developmental disabilities. So I'm just really happy to be here and excited to engage with this panel.
Great, thanks, Emma. Nancy.
Thanks so much, Fred. My name is Nancy D. Miller, and I'm the Executive Director, CEO of Visions, Services for the Blind and Visually Impaired. I am 5 feet tall. I am white. I have brown hair, short. I wear glasses, and I'm the parent of a child with vision problems. I've been the CEO for 36 years at Visions. Started working with people who are blind and multi-disabled 52 years ago. And the emphasis that we have right now at Visions is on DEIA, and we add the A at the end for accessibility. And we serve about 7,000 people each year in 14 counties in New York State, from just south of Albany to the tip of Long Island, through the 5 boroughs of New York City. Nice to meet everyone.
Thank you, Nancy. And last but not least, Mel.
Oh, good morning, Freddie, and all the other panelists. My name's Mel Tansman. I'm a 72-year-old retiree with gray hair and gray beard, wearing a green polo shirt, which has the wheelchair accessible sign on it. I go by he and him. And a little bit about me. I retired in 2019 as the executive director of Westchester Disabled on the Move, which is an independent living center that's based in Yonkers. I worked at that position for 20 years, and prior to that, another 15 years for spinal cord injured veterans. I am a member of, I was fortunate enough to become a member of the New York State Disability Rights Hall of Fame in 2021. And I remain quite involved and dedicated to disability rights. And my specialties were always around the areas of housing and personal care, home care, Medicaid. So I'm really happy to be here today to share the platform with these other great, experts.
Fantastic. Thank you, Mel. Thank you to all for the introduction. As you all can see, we have a great panel, lots of experiences, perspectives, and I think, the power of a panel is the different ways in which we interact with the world, right? And so not all of us do the same things, not all of us respond the same way, but we're responding. And I think we'll flesh a little bit of that out as we go through the conversation. Before we get started with some questions, I want to just kind of lay the foundation, right? So the American Disabilities Act is a law that protects people with disabilities in everyday activities from discrimination, and really kind of goes, to specifics on employment, purchasing of goods, housing, and many others. Today we'll hit, obviously, talking about realtors with HGAR. So we'll hit a lot of topics that they are familiar with in terms of service animals in housing, effective communication, inclusionary practices, and really trying to do the best we can so that we can be the realtor of choice for anyone looking for a home. And so that's really what we want to get to. In creating this panel, we obviously note the fair housing legislations and laws that we must abide by. But, the part of the conversation is also being, a good neighbor, a good person, going beyond the law to service a community. And so that's kind of where we hope the conversation takes us. And then lastly, we are a group of industry experts in many different facets. But for the audience, please participate, share your questions on the Q&A on the bottom. We'll try to get to them as we go through the session. We may not have all the answers today of all your questions. Not all of us are attorneys or your attorney. And so I want to put that up front. And if you do want to pursue a particular question we can't answer, or maybe we need more information, please reach out to myself at HGAR. You can certainly call the NYSAR hotline, which many of you are familiar with, or consult your own attorney as well. So again, that's a little bit of housekeeping. Again, just want to jump right in. And so we'll start with the first question. And this is for Naudi. Obviously, in your role, you've seen a lot. You worked in Orange County for 6 years. You're heavily involved in the community. Can you talk a little bit about why is it important to go beyond the fair housing laws and legislations? What are the benefits, for inclusion versus just following the law?
Absolutely. Thank you, Freddie, for that question. So I've actually been working in Orange County in different ways, right, for 17 years. And before I was in human rights, I focused on gender violence, working with victims of sexual assault, domestic violence, human trafficking. So I've been working with folks who are displaced, who face housing discrimination for familial status, for domestic violence status, right, for really quite a long time. And particularly the important thing to understand, I guess, to begin with, right, you talk about setting the foundation, is the difference between Fair Housing Act and exclusionary practice, which are the actions, right? Those are the policies. Personally, sometimes when I think of things like systemic problems, they feel overwhelming and they feel almost like, oh, I don't know, how am I going to tackle that, right? How am I going to way over my head? So I want to bring us back to why is it important that individuals, that people are inclusive? Because at the end of the day, we have to work towards eliminating unfair practices, illegal, right, practices. We have to work towards creating policies that are more inclusionary of everyone within our community, right? But what about our own biases? What about our own practices, right? So part of being exclusionary on an individual level includes a realtor who is biased and won't show one property or a property to someone who's in a wheelchair because in their mind, they're like, oh, well, maybe this isn't the best practice or property for them. Let me show them something here, right? Whether it's race or color or gender, et cetera, right? Where they have assumptions about the neighborhood and whether or not someone will benefit or like that neighborhood or that area. Those are the practices that as individuals, again, we really, it's up to us. It's our responsibility to focus on them. And then your question is the why. Aside from it's the right thing to do, right? Aside from because we want to be better humans and we want to be better people, it's honestly because diverse communities thrive. When individuals thrive, right? When individual human beings, when people are with dignity included in the spaces that they live, when they're able to access something as basic as housing, right? Accessible housing, affordable, accessible housing, right? We can have thriving communities. Research actually shows that diverse communities are also more likely to economically thrive than non-diverse communities. So it's about looking at where are the benefits, but again, it comes down to people.
Yeah. I couldn't say it better myself. I think, you know, fair housing certainly is intended to limit discrimination, and that is its intended purpose. I think when we go above and beyond that, we have it has a positive impact for the clients we work with. I think it has a positive impact for the communities we live in, the reputation of where we work and who we represent, and in its totality, our profession. And so again, fair housing gives us the map to make sure that everyone has the equal access. And I think that step forward, to your point, Inaudi, is exactly right. It helps us build trust. It helps us build referrals. It helps us build a viable relationship with people for the long term. And so I think that's really what we hope, people
Which, Freddie, also in turn really helps the point of the Fair Housing Act, right? Which is diverse communities. So it's up to us too.
Right. Absolutely. So to kind of take the conversation a little bit to another topic, but similar, Nancy, you know, obviously you've worked in this space for a long time, in many different capacities, personal, professional. You know, realtors not only have to think about, you know, the clients they work with, but the pipeline of future clients. You know, what are some of the things someone can do right now to signal that they're willing to work with anyone, particularly in this community? You know, whether it's, you know, promotion, you know, what they see, language, et cetera.
Thanks so much for the question, Freddie. So in the work that I do, I often interact with people who are blind or multi-disabled who are looking for housing, and also with realtors who are looking for clients. And there are signals that people can give to say that they're open to working with everybody. So some of the signals, we're familiar with the LGBTQ community, where if you have a rainbow flag, that's kind of a quick way of saying, I'm open to serving that particular community. Or, if you have something that says Black Lives Matter, that's like a shortcut to say, I'm open to working with that community. But if somebody's blind, they may not be able to see whatever it is that you are promoting to say you are welcome as well. So here are some of the tips that are kind of shortcuts to saying, I am open to serving people who are blind or people of any type of disability. So being able to have the wheelchair symbol is a shortcut to say, I'm aware of it, I know it, and I'm open to people with disabilities. To have on your card, your website, your promotional material as a realtor to say, tell me how I can help you. That says they're not making an assumption of what they're supposed to do based on how you look or how you present yourself. It's, I am open to hearing what it is you need from me and how I can be most helpful. Obviously, having a website that's accessible to a screen reading software immediately says, I am open and my website is going to describe the photographs. It's going to make it clear that it's accessible to people who are using specialized software. If there are videos, which are very common in both renting and selling properties now, is it closed caption? Is it narrated? Those are accommodations that even before you ask, the realtor is saying, I know that these are needs of at least 25% of the population that identifies as having a disability. You're already presenting yourself as open to serving that population. When you're meeting somebody in person, the most important thing is not to assume. Don't assume because a person who is blind that they need a particular kind of housing. They'll know what kind of housing they need or want. You need to ask. Same thing with a person who may be blind and a wheelchair user. If you're not sure, ask. And even if you think you're sure, just make sure you ask again to make sure that your assumption is correct. So it's a dialogue. And we always talk about reasonable accommodation. Well, how do you get to a reasonable accommodation? You have to ask the person exactly what it is they need. I always encourage realtors to learn human guide technique. That is the proper way to walk with somebody who is blind or visually impaired, where they take your elbow. You don't take their arm, you don't push them forward, you don't pull them, but they take your arm and you lead them where you're 1 or 2 steps ahead, which gives them a clue of whether you're going up or down stairs, whether you're going around a corner. It's very simple to learn. It's something that Visions teaches. All of the independent living centers teach human guide. And it's kind of ammunition that you have that says, I know how to properly interact with and walk with somebody who might be visually impaired. So there are the subtle signals, and then there are the obvious. There is nothing wrong with the realtor saying, I am open to serving everyone, and then you'll have to prove it. But even making that statement is saying you are open to a very diverse clientele.
Thank you, Nancy. Absolutely. And those are great examples, I think. And we've got two questions, that I think we can certainly, and if any other panelist wants to jump in, feel free, and I agree. I think, a lot of realtors say, we work with everyone. Why would I need to specifically, say I work with this? But I think there are signals that when people are making choices, when people are on a website, when they're on your social media, right, they're trying to figure out if you're the best person to work with. And when you have a website that is accessible, or uses just a simple term like translation services available, right? It says to me something, and so that's what we're looking for. It's not to say that you don't, but when people make decisions, they're looking for signals to say, yes, you're the person I want to work with. And I think that's the idea of these signals.
Can I piggyback off of that?
Yeah, please.
So to your point of, it's not about, and to answer the person's question, we already serve everyone. It's not about the service you provide. It's understanding that especially folks from marginalized communities are very well used to not being provided services by everyone, right? So they are actively seeking the friendlies, right? Because they are concerned that someone will judge them or misunderstand them or flat out refuse to give them services based on whatever that one identity is. So it's not about our intention, it's about understanding the communities and how they have to protect themselves too.
Yeah, I'd like to also weigh in on this. I think the most important thing for a realtor is to show that they want to work with everybody, is issues like your offices. Are there ramps there? Is your bathroom accessible? Do you have Braille on the door to identify the building? Do you plan beforehand? For instance, are all of your materials available in an alternate format, like Braille, like tape, like, I mean, so much right now, is available just, in an electronic version. So you can't say, well, yeah, well, maybe I can get that to you. If you show that you're aware of it and you have it and at the ready, basically somebody asks you for it and you can either email it to them or give it to them right away, that shows that you're really ready to work with everybody.
Thank you for that. And again, I think there's so much you can do. If you're doing none, there's so much you can start with and over time grow. And I think, the idea of this panel is to at least put in front of you some folks you can reach out to that can help you navigate some of that as well. So Mel, kind of jump into you, reasonable accommodation, modifications, words that, again, realtors are familiar with. Some are new in the business, may not have come across it, face to face. Can you talk a little bit about, what is it? What kind of guidance do you give as people kind of navigate these spaces, and anything else in terms of resources that you can share?
Sure. Jumping back to something Anadi said about, systemic rather than individual change. I think the big difference between reasonable accommodation and modification is that, one, reasonable accommodation basically is responding to a request, let's say of a tenant of somebody, okay? While a modification has to do more with broader policy issues, systems issues. For instance, I'm going to give one example on that. It has to relate to real estate. Let's say you have a building which has parking for their tenants. However, none of the spots are assigned. A person who requires an accessible parking spot can do one of two things. They could say, can you assign me in particular, a parking spot, which is easy access to the building and which will be assigned to me and me alone? Or to look at it more in terms of a modification, he or she could say, hey, Mr. Landlord, have you considered assigning spaces and making sure that 20% or a certain percent of the spaces are available, for ADA parking? So, it really gets down to whether it's a response to an individual or whether you're being asked to actually change a systemic policy that your organization or business may have, that if you change it, you'll be, less discriminatory.
And where can folks find some resources around some of this guidance, or if they have a question, where can they go, who can they call? And I'll share a few as well.
Well,
any thoughts?
I did see that on your agenda you had some resources, but there are a lot of other resources besides that. I know that online there is HUD also has like a sub a website that's called Fair Housing First. And if you go to that, it will answer specific questions about fair housing. There are also throughout the nation, actually, ADA business information centers. The one that covers the Northeast and New York is up at Cornell. And they are good in terms of, if you give them a call, answering questions about, the ADA, their housing, and everything else. And lastly, I would say your community-based organizations, your independent living centers. I spent, like I said, 20 years running an independent living center, and I often got calls from landlords who want to know, well, what do I have to do to help this individual? So they are a resource. I think they're a good resource because they're local. I believe at this point we're about 41 or 42 centers in all of New York State. Every county has one, several in New York City, 2 here in Westchester, 1 in Rockland, 1 in Putnam, 1 in Orange. So we're all over the place. And I think that contact is really important. If you don't know how to contact them, you can also contact, there is a state association for independent living, which is called the New York Association on Independent Living, which is based in Albany, and they can send you information about any independent living center, who they are, who the executive director is, and what the contacts are.
That's great. That's great. And I also say, your local Human Rights Commission. I think it's a great place to start. Again, they work and deal with a lot of these issues head on a regular basis. They've certainly been a go-to for us at HGAR. I would say us at HGAR, if you have questions, need a connection, things of that nature, again, reach out to us as your local. And lastly, I think it's a great resource, and something that realtors should certainly use more often is the New York State Association of Realtors hotline, the NYSAR hotline, which again, you can call with questions. They have attorneys on the other end that can kind of walk you through some of that. And the number, again, just to share, is 518-436-NYSAR. So again, that's another great resource that you can use at any time as well. And again, I know there's questions, some questions that are coming in. Panelists, feel free to respond if you like. But if those that we don't, we'll try to get to them towards the end. Emma, just to kind of include you in the discussion, and I think it may relate to some of the or at least one of the questions in the Q&A. Can you mentioned you don't deal with the building, but you deal with the people, but because you deal with the people, you deal with the building, right? So they come to you one way or another around some of those issues. So can you talk a little bit about some of the barriers that are commonly found on properties that I think need to be addressed by ADA compliance, or things you come across as you helping folks navigate the housing market?
Absolutely. I did want to just harken back to something that Nancy said earlier, in that really your number one resource is the person that you're working with, right? So, if you want to know about an accommodation or a modification, you need to ask that person, what do they need? What do they want? What are they looking for, right? That is always the place to start when you're really trying to help someone plan ahead. From a barrier perspective, it's interesting. I always find, people in the building world in particular are pretty familiar with guidelines, right? How to design a building, how many units in a building should be accessible, what are some standard modifications or accommodations that are put in. So, is that maybe grab bars in a bathroom or widened doorways or anything of that nature? But what I have found is that it's often just the little things that people seem to miss when we're doing building. So for example, I went to a building the other day, I walked into the parking lot and there was a beautiful curb cut in the parking lot. But the curb cut was cut into a regular parking space. And so if anyone is parked in that space, no one can actually access the curb cut, right? So there are often these barriers that you see that people just sort of need to be kind of keeping an eye out. One that you see often in the wintertime is snow plowing, right? So again, beautiful curb cuts, you're walking down a city street, but the snow plows have come in and that's where they've packed all the snow. So it's these, even if we build things correctly, we're still creating these barriers for people to be able to access their everyday world that we really need to be kind of taking a look at.
Great. Any other examples on that? Nancy, Melvin, no.
Sometimes it's, a lot of time it's design in a building for folks who might use a walker or use a wheelchair. A real barrier is the pile in a carpet, right? Because you're not able to move freely through that space. Sometimes it's how and where furniture is placed and kind of not communicating where those things are. I found in a lot of buildings, especially in senior buildings, people build wonderful landscapes with pavers and all of these different wonderful products, but what they end up doing is creating some real architectural barriers for people to move freely through a space, because you're creating these uneven walkways. So curb cuts, elevators, pavers, all of these design elements really can be removed when we're designing and building these buildings, and really should be taken into consideration.
Yeah, and Emma, thanks. It is interesting. I think, as much as folks who do this and are constantly thinking about it, they may, build a building, obviously with that in mind or with compliance in mind. I think the one of the most powerful ways for all of us to make a difference, in my opinion, is navigating the space with that in mind, right? So it's not just to say we have it check, but walk that, go through that space, thinking about those things, and you may pick things up. I often share, I'm a enabled person. I never really had to think about certain things. And in my life has changed the last 2 years or so with children. and I push a stroller every so often. And I was at a store looking for the elevator, and I couldn't find the elevator. And I was, and again, these are things that for the most part, if you're not thinking about them, you just it may not come across your mind. So again,
Freddie, can I
yeah,
add some
please,
thoughts
Naudi.
to that too?
Absolutely.
So one of the lines that I like to use is also remembering to think beyond the ramp, right? Because often you are absolutely correct. We don't know what to consider, and that's really also why it's so important to have diversity, right? Because when you've got different minds, people with different experiences, they can then share and add. But when I also think about the things to consider around us, taking it back to the individual, right? Things like language access, right? Are we making sure that our materials are in multiple languages? As a neurodivergent individual, my brain just thinks differently and focuses differently, right? So are we providing the information that we're trying to get out there in different ways, whether it's videos or whether it's audio? And something like, websites and on our phones, how friendly is it? But are we considering, again, the thinking outside of the ramp? So I love the idea of, Freddie doing the walkthrough, right? But now take that step further, consider your practices as a realtor. What does that look like for someone who is neurodivergent, for someone who is blind, for someone who is deaf, for someone who may not have, English isn't their first language. So just considering so many different things, which, by the way, when you are an able-bodied person, right, Freddie, when we have these privileges of not having to think of these things, it's going to take research. It's going to take looking things up. It's going to take building community within these groups and saying, hey, a few of us should get together and talk about what are some of the things we should do and we can do, and what are some of the challenges, because you're going to face challenges, but being intentional about doing them.
And go ahead, Nancy, please.
Nancy, I just wanted to add, because there's an assumption from the able-bodied community that once you've met a blind person, you now know what to do. And every blind person is unique. So they may request, for example, if you're doing a walkthrough of an apartment or a home, they want every detail. They may want a description of everything that a sighted person would see. Another blind person may not want that kind of description at all. So just because you've met somebody with that particular disability, don't assume that everybody with that disability is going to want the same information or is going to need the same accommodation. It is so individual. And those of us who do this every day say, when you meet one blind person, you've met one blind person. Don't assume that they represent the entire community. And I think we're more sensitive to that maybe when we're talking about language or we're talking about ethnicity, but people don't think about it with disability. They just assume everybody who is a wheelchair user is exactly the same, wants the same things, needs the same amount of help, or doesn't need the same amount of help. And that's why getting rid of those stereotypes and assumptions is so key. Just be comfortable with saying, I am not sure how I can best help you. Can you tell me? Start with the assumption that you don't know. And that person almost always will be comfortable with saying, well, what would really help me is, and they'll be very specific about their particular circumstance.
Right, and just to jump on with that, not everybody, let's say, who uses a wheelchair, who has a mobility impairment, has even the same needs in the bathroom. Some people cannot transfer from a wheelchair into a bath, so they need a roll-in shower. Others are perfectly fine transferring onto a bath bench. So yeah, it is important not to generalize. You know, people are unique. I mean, one of the things, and I'm sure Nancy would agree to this, is that, you know, people with disabilities all find their own ways of getting around and doing things. Some of them are very conventional, and some of them are very unconventional. What they're comfortable is what's important here. So, you know, often a physical therapist might even say to a person with disability, oh, no, you should be doing it this way. And that person with the disability would say, wait a minute, I've been doing this for 20 years this way, and this is what works for me. So I think that's important to keep in mind.
Thank you. And it's and the last note on the barriers piece, I think, and for those who attended, we host a DEI summit. We're in our second year. Next year will be our third. But one of the keynote speakers talked about the curbside effect, and basically talking about the benefit for a community in many instances benefits all of us, right? How many of us use a curbside? You know, without even thinking about it, or take the elevator, or, you know, use that, you know, handle in the shower at a hotel, and so again, even when we're not thinking about it, it's benefiting us. And why not take that extra step to make sure that a segment of our community not only feels appreciated, but feels as if they have an opportunity to excel as well. And I think that's the essence of going beyond just the law, is going, you know, in terms of, you know, people's experiences when they interact with us, or when they, you know, work with us as realtors. You know, the ADA Act has you know, been reading, and there's a lot of things in there. One of the major questions that comes up often in our space is on assistance animals. And so, you know, in New York State, we talk about service animals. We also talk about emotional support animals. You know, whether they're the same, different, equal. Mel, do you want to maybe, you know, walk us through that a little bit, and then we'll get some of the panelists to chime in a bit.
Well, sure. The big thing to know is that it's not only the ADA. The ADA really only recognized, I believe, at this point, you know, more traditional service animals, seeing eye dogs, etc. However, New York state laws specifically talk about, in real estate, the need for people to have even, you know, comfort animals. Now, it doesn't cover, you know, let's say if somebody wants to take their comfort animal into a store necessarily, but a landlord cannot refuse a support animal, an emotional support animal, if the tenant or potential tenant is able to get something from a psychotherapist, a psychiatrist, any kind of a professional, saying that his or her patient requires it. Okay, you can't question, say, why do you need that? You know, there isn't a need. You can't ask them what kind of support does this animal give you. That's specifically in housing. And any questions about that, because it's a state rather than a federal thing, I would say the New York State Division of, I'm sorry, I'm just blanking at the moment. Somebody will help me come up with it, I'm sure.
The New York State Division of Human Rights.
Human rights,
Yeah,
yep.
Division of Human Rights is really the best way to go about it. They've actually put out a lot of written materials about, you know, support animals, including emotional support animals. And, you know, it does get a little sticky sometimes, because I know some of my colleagues and friends who are blind and require guide dogs, that sometimes I wouldn't say resent people who have emotional support animals. They kind of say, we get questioned more because, it's covered too many things. My animal is trained, it's certified, etc. But all the needs in all the communities have to be identified and really accommodated. So that's New York State in terms of in housing, that it doesn't require any proof other than a medical or psychiatric provider saying that his patient or her patient needs it.
Right. Anyone would like to add anything on assistance animals? Okay.
Yeah, this is Nancy. I just wanted to add, though, that there are times when circumstances occur where the dog may not be behaving properly. Now, that's a whole different situation. That's not a question of access, but there have been cases where dogs have, done their business in the hallway, or a dog may be barking incessantly during evening hours. And, the realtor or the manager or the homeowner, you can request that dog behave properly.
Mhm.
And sometimes we get the opposite of people who are so reluctant to bring up the topic that situations go on for much longer than they should, because people are afraid of, the backlash, or they're afraid they're doing the wrong thing. Use common sense. If a dog is doing their business in the hallway, that dog is probably not well or not well trained, and they go back to the training school and get retrained so that they are not a nuisance. So I think there's this balance between dog guides for people who are blind can go anywhere the person goes. That's the law. Anywhere, restaurant,
Yep.
wherever they live, wherever they're traveling. They have to be picked up by taxis. They have to be picked up by on demand. But that doesn't mean that that dog is allowed to bite or incessantly bark or do something that a well-trained dog wouldn't do. So again, I think always understand what the law says, but know that there is a response if a dog or any support animal is creating a problem in the building because of behavior.
Right. I just want to agree. Just quickly, I know, and I think Nancy was really important. You said this because before you did, I wanted to point out that the good thing about guide dogs for the blind, as Nancy said, any school, if you report that kind of behavior, they know that that dog either is not fit to be a guide dog, or needs to be retrained. I have a friend up in Albany who had a new guide dog after having one for a while, got a new one, who would like in a restaurant go up to other people's tables and eat their food. So, he knew that that guide dog was not going to work out. Unfortunately, with emotional support animals, there are no guidelines, for training. It's very vague. It just might be that little Dusty just keeps me comfortable and makes me feel safe. But he or she may be disruptive in the building, and your other tenants have rights as well. And I think Nancy's point is very, very well taken. And I give the community of schools that teach guide dogs a lot of credit for having the kind of standards that are necessary so they meet the needs of their clients, but also respect the needs of the people around them too.
Freddie, I think it's really important that we recognize that emotional support animals are not service animals and are not covered in public spaces under New York state law.
Mhm.
They are covered in housing under the Fair Housing Act, but not in public spaces. So if you even think about when you're out and about at the stores that allow pets, you won't ever see anything other than a dog, right? And it's a service dog who is clearly working. And that's because the law does not define emotional support animals as service animals. So I just want to make sure that because there's a lot of nuance.
Yeah, so you took it right out of me. I was about to just clarify that one point. And again, service animals are performing a task based on the person's disability, right? And so they are working and so that's it. And so it's not the same. They are different. And again, it's a lot of to Mel's point in terms of emotional support animals. I think they're still developing. There's still a lot of questions. And so again, continue to consult with the right people on any questions you may have on that. But both, whether you have a no pet policy or, again, if with the right documentation and so forth, right, both are allowed in a home, in a rental one way or another. So just keep that in mind as well. We've hit a lot of the questions, additional questions that I had, I think, from those who've asked questions, but from the conversations we've had. One of the things that I think is also important for us to be aware of is, what kind of things might be coming down the pipe, right? So, are there any legislative things that we, as realtors and the real estate industry should be aware of? If there's anything that you're seeing or that you're working on that may be helpful for us to know as we navigate spaces, anything on the legislative front in the communities that we want to share with our members.
Yeah, I definitely do. I mean, one of the things we haven't really talked about today, but we need to understand is that unfortunately, most people with disabilities are on fixed incomes. So the affordability part, although it's not necessarily, well, it is part of fair housing, and it's really needed by individuals with disabilities. In terms of some of the housing things that are going on in New York State, there are bills that are being considered that would have new subsidies for people who are low income. And the other thing that's really important, that's been a very, very big cause for some debate, is the requirement in the law for only good cause evictions. In other words, unfortunately, some landlords feel now that the market has changed. This person has lived there for 5 years. They have a very low rent. They can get a lot more. And sometimes they will, not renew a lease because they know they can get more. There is a bill that's been pending for the last 2 years on good cause eviction, basically stating that a landlord will have to, give some legitimate causes, which will probably be written in the bill, to move forward with an eviction. That doesn't mean that a person can, not be evicted if they are not paying their rent or being a nuisance or disturbance to others. It just means there are more protections for tenants and for people with disabilities and tenants with disabilities who have a hard enough time finding accessible units. To find accessible and affordable units is a double whammy, and always will. Well, until things change a lot in our culture, where we're marginalized, we're going to be, unfortunately, at the lower range of the income scale. Many of us, most of us.
Yeah, Freddie, one area that is still still actually under construction, as they would say, is website accessibility. The Department of Justice just promulgated some regulations which are open for comment right now on the obligation of government and website accessibility, but they have not specifically addressed private businesses and what the obligations are. And different courts have determined what they think the ADA says or doesn't say. The Federal Department of Justice has made it very clear that websites must be accessible, but they have not required a specific standard, which makes it very difficult for a business to know exactly what they need to do in order to make their website accessible. There are suggested standards, which are called WCAG. You can Google it, and it will give you all the standards to follow. But even with those voluntary standards, there are different levels of accessibility. So I think it's important to just be aware of the fact that some of the legal opinion is still under construction right now. And hopefully Department of Justice will require certain standards rather than have it battled out in the court.
All right. Thank you, Nancy. Anyone else? Emma, Naudi, anything on your end? Okay. And Nancy, I think we, in our pre discussion, I think you also mentioned about, lighting and numbers and, again, when numbers on buildings and things like that in terms of consistency. Can you speak a little bit about kind of some of those challenges?
Sure. So in New York City, there is no standard of what the building number looks like, where it's located, what kind of font it uses. We get complaints all the time, not only from people who are blind, but from sighted people who can't figure out how to get to the entrance of a building, or they're not sure if they're going to the right building. That would go a long way in helping people with disabilities navigate if there was a standard of an easy to read font, meaning the typeface doesn't have any curly cues, what we call sans serif. The lighting in front of buildings, very important that the lighting is non-glare. For somebody who's visually impaired, that glare could be the difference between being able to read with their partial vision or remaining vision where they are. There are no standards of how building frontage is lit. One of the things that realtors can do in your own offices is to walk into your office and think about all the different types of disabilities that your clients may come with. And, if the front of your building or the front of your office is very dark, that's going to be especially difficult for people with vision loss. If you don't have a ramp, obviously a wheelchair user is not going to be able to get into your building. How confusing is your front? Sometimes a person with a developmental disability or a neurodiverse individual may get confused if that signage or that building front is not clear and easy to read and easy to find. So we're often advocating for the city to come up with a standard that would make it easier for people to navigate around New York City. And it should be universally designed. We use that to mean that when a building is designed, it takes into account everybody who may be using or entering that building. And they're not building it specifically for a person with a disability. They're building it so that anybody, disabled or not, is able to enter that building as easily, and same way we have curb cuts that are used by wheelchair users and people in baby carriages. It's universally designed. You don't have to explain who is going to use it. It's going to help everybody. Somebody with packages that doesn't want to climb up and down, might be an older person who uses a cane. So really encouraging and really talking about universal design that makes it possible for everybody to feel welcomed is something that we advocate for.
Absolutely. And going back to my previous point, you know, and the benefit that has to all of us, right? Who wouldn't want more lighting? Who wouldn't want clear signage? And so I think, again, these are conversations that we should be having more often, in particularly the real estate industry, as we think about accessibility for anyone around these issues. So again, you know, lighting, safety, there's a lot of things that covers that I think can certainly be something we can discuss. So, you know, in terms of reasonable accommodation and modification, just kind of want to go through a list of things, and then for those who have joined us today, we have a couple of polls of some scenarios that we want you to participate in, see if hopefully this was helpful. But in terms of reasonable accommodations and modification, right? Assigning an accessible parking spot for a person with mobility impairment, right? Yes, that is exactly what that's designed for, right? Adjusting rent payment schedule to accommodate when an individual receives income assistance, right? Another accommodation to be supportive and kind of in line with the law. Adding a grab bar in the bathroom, which we talked about, right? In certain places in the household. Permitting assistance animals in a no pet building for a person who again has one. So these are things that I think you will come across. You if not already, you will in many instances. And again, being prepared, being knowledgeable, and if you don't know, knowing the right people to go to and the services and who to ask, I think is critically important. So we do have these polls. Gary, if you can hear me, we'd love to launch the first one. Here we are, and I'll read it out loud, and please participate if you're on if you're still with us. So, someone in a wheelchair moved into a building. The entrance for the individual was in the back, which had a ramp, but often it wasn't shoveled during the snow, cleaned off, and when requested to be done to the landlord, they refused. Is this a fair housing violation, an exclusionary practice? Is it both, or is it legal to just say no? So please participate in this, and then we'll have a panel discussion on this. Hopefully we get 100% right. Gary?
And responses are coming in, so just give me a moment.
Yeah, whenever you're ready, feel free to share that.
Let's give it 10 more seconds.
Great. Okay, so we got 12% fair housing violation, another 12 exclusionary practice, 76% both, no one on the legal side. So it is actually both. Mel, would you like to jump in on this one?
Sure. Unfortunately, this is a true story that a tenant who just recently had moved in complained about that, and the landlord, who was discriminating, but also wasn't very bright, had the nerve to say to me, you know, if I knew he used a wheelchair, I would never have written to him. This was brought to the Westchester County Human Rights Commission, and the landlord was in fact had damages, you know, assessed to them. So, you know, in some ways, because the landlord just seemed so, you know, unknowledgeable, I felt a little bad for him, but it's his job as a landlord to know the applicable, you know, laws and standards. So, you know, it kind of bit him, and it happened.
Thank you, Mel. Appreciate that. Gary, we can go to the next one.
This is the follow-up to that one.
No, do the totally completely next one, not the follow. All right,
number
number 2. Thank you. Tenant contacts landlord to widen doorways and remove an entry step, citing safety and independent living concerns. The landlord discusses with the tenant and consults a licensed contractor, but the cost is too much to bear and decides not to do it unless the tenant pays. Fair housing violation, exclusionary practice, both are legal.
Results are coming in.
Great.
Give it 20 more seconds.
Great. And just as we wait, you know, the scenarios is a way for us to interpret kind of some of the experiences that people been through. Not every situation is the same. So I do want to put that caveat in front of us. So it may seem similar. It may have things that, you know, kind of connect. It may have things that may not make too much sense. But I all in all, I want to make sure that we know that, you know, not every situation is the same and should be analyzed as it comes. So no one noted as a fair housing violation, exclusionary practice. We got 2 folks there, both 5 at 36% and then legal at 50%. So it is legal. So again, if it's a burden to the tenant, they could say to the landlord, they could say to the tenant, if you want to, you know, contribute to that's fine. We've seen many examples where, you know, the landlord and the tenant kind of work together to figure out what's a happy medium. What are some community resources available that can help, you know, support some of those modifications or, you know, changes. So again, there are ways to go about it. I think the moral of that story is to seek feedback, right? Reach out to your local organizations, community partners, human rights commissions, and see where, again, you can maybe find some resources to support some of those individuals in your building, your community that may need some assistance there.
I would like to clarify a little bit because unfortunately the scenario is a little bit vague, and that is what I struggled with is a step into an apartment is not part of the apartment. It is part of the common space. So there's a difference here in terms of the Fair Housing Act about modifications to your own apartment. And yes, a landlord can require, you know, that a tenant take on the expenses themselves. But if it's in the common area, it is the landlord's responsibility under the Fair Housing Act.
And Mel, thank you.
It's a little tricky there.
No, and that's a great catch. Unfortunately, Zoom limits us to some words, and so we might have lost an important an important word to that. So again, Mel, thank you for chiming in on that for sure. And then Gary, we could put the last one up, and then we can go from there. So a new tenant due to their disability requires the cabinets, counters, and shelves moved to a lower standing so they are handicap accessible. After 7 years living there, 7 years after the change, tenant decides to move out and receives a bill from landlord to return property back to its original form. For housing violation, exclusionary practice, both illegal.
Responses are coming in.
Great. And it was a learning experience for me to go through these as well. And so I think, again, whether it's something you do on a regular basis, something you may not, first time, second time, refreshers are always helpful as we navigate this work. Okay. All right, we have a violation. We have 29%, exclusionary practice is 7%, both 7%, legal 57%. So it is actually legal. And so as we think about the use of it, but again, you know, back to our previous point, I want to make sure that we are thinking about ways to balance the table there, right? So what are some resources, who they should be reaching out? So just saying, here's a bill, good luck, I think, again, probably not the right way to go about it, right? Especially if the person wasn't aware, that conversation wasn't had, and so forth. And I think, you know, the hope is that it was discussed beforehand. But if not, again, how can we, what should we, how do we support, who do we call? Maybe there's an advocate, maybe there's a group, maybe, you know, I know organizations, whether, you know, nonprofit organizations who, you know, this is the type of things that they fundraise for to support communities. So again, I think there's a plethora of resources out there. It is, again, legal to convert it back and have that responsibility to the tenant. But again, I think there are plenty of resources and opportunities to at least engage in conversation and discussion. So we are kind of rounding up our time here. I want to give our panelists maybe some last minute thoughts, things you want to leave our audience with, and we'll kind of go backwards. So we'll start with Mel and then kind of work our way back. So Mel, any last minute thoughts before we depart?
Yeah, I think that we're all dealing with a housing crisis here in New York State. And we know, I know, and I know Nancy knows, and I'm sure that Inadi knows that it affects, you know, different people and marginalized people in different ways. I think it's really important to understand the unique needs of people with disabilities. Of course, you know, we come from all walks of life. We're businessmen, we're corporate executives, and we're people who are on fixed incomes. But, you know, it's unfortunate that many people with significant disabilities end up, you know, basically institutionalized because they can't find affordable, accessible housing. And that's just not acceptable, especially in these post-pandemic days where I think everybody has concluded that if somebody can be kept outside of a facility, that independent living is the healthiest and safest thing for all people. So that's my final thoughts.
Thank you, Mel. Nancy.
Yes, I wanted to just quickly bring up an issue that we didn't really discuss, which is this belief that somehow if you rent to a person with a disability, that your insurance will go up, that'll affect your insurance rates, that people with disabilities are not safe. I've heard that myth and concern mentioned over and over again, and it's exactly the opposite. Mm-hmm. You actually find people with disabilities are less likely to have accidents, less likely to have insurance claims, because obviously they're being very careful to make sure that they are safe. It is no more than the general population. the other thing I wanted to mention is that there is some very good recent articles on home accessibility. There was one in the New York Times just this past Sunday. So if you're looking for who pays for reasonable accommodations, there are so many programs out there, either through the state, through private foundations that will pay for the accommodations. Lions clubs are particularly geared to helping people who are blind, since they were knighted by Helen Keller. The Kiwanis Club is dedicated to making life better for children. And those local service clubs will often help pay for some of the accommodations if the landlord can't afford it, or even if there's a device that a person needs that isn't paid for through their health insurance. So assume that there's help out there, both for advice on what is legal and not, but also in helping to pay for some of the accommodations.
Thank you, Nancy. Emma, last minute thoughts.
I think my last minute thoughts are just really about, you know, people being open-minded and communicating and just sort of being aware of where they are and what they're seeing, and trying to remove those barriers themselves when they see them. Because like you said, you know, throughout this whole panel, Freddie, you know, it really is about this philosophy of universal design. It's really about living in a world where people are fully included. And so, you know, if that's, you know, buttons on buildings because it, you know, maybe a wheelchair user needs to get in, but me carrying all my groceries also loves that button, right? And just really thinking about how, as you operate through space, the ways in which every day you benefit from some of these design features, and what you can do in your own world to make sure that you are presenting an openness and a willingness to engage and learn and, you know, remove some of those barriers, which I think everyone that's in attendance today is open to doing. And so I just thank everyone for coming today.
Thank you, Emma. And Naudi.
I think Emma segued perfectly into my final 2 cents, and that's being intentional about our own individual work. And if we want to be a part of solutions when it comes to systems and breaking down barriers that were created many, many, many years ago, but still exist today, that a very large part of that is us looking at our own internal biases. It's us looking at our own growth and our own willingness and openness to learn and to unlearn a lot of the things that exist in our brains. So thank you also everyone who showed up, who came. It is definitely a testament to what you would like to do professionally and how you want to serve your community, and keep it going. Don't stop there.
Thank you. Thank you. So I can't thank each and one of you enough for joining us and taking time for this important conversation. You know, I think, you know, from you know, my experience in working with our realtors, you know, you come across things that forces you to learn, forces you to engage, forces you to have conversations. I think the intentionality, I think, is even more powerful when, you know, you're prepared before the situation occurs, right? And so that's what we're hoping for. That's we really want our realtors to connect with community in a way that's productive, effective, and beneficial to everyone involved. So again, I can't thank each and every one of you for getting involved. Just a last minute note, we have a plethora of events at HGAR. We have some county days coming up. We have Women in Commercial taking place tomorrow. So please visit our events at hgar.com/events for things that are coming up. But again, can't thank this panel enough for sharing the words and wisdom. A lot of knowledge and experience here. So again, Naudi, Emma, Nancy, Mel, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you, Freddie.
Have a good day, everyone.
Thank you.